Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at part 2 of chapter 1 of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. In part 1 we looked at Mr. Utterson in quite a bit of detail, and I don't want to make these videos too long, so I decided to make that a first part. And now second part we're going to be looking at the first mention of Mr. Hyde, Mr. Utterson finding out about Mr. Hyde. If you haven't read chapter 1, please do read that before you continue with this video, and please do make notes as I'm going through this, because all of this is the analysis and the context that you need for your exam, okay? So let's dive into chapter 1. After Utterson has been described at the beginning, we see that he's on his usual Sunday walk with his cousin, Mr. Enfield, and as they're walking through the streets of London, they come across a sinister block of building thrust forward, and this is a kind of repeated idea. I don't know if I'd call it a motif, I guess I kind of would, of using buildings. And also he uses the weather, which is pathetic fallacy, of course, to kind of indicate a sense of foreboding and sort of the idea that there is this real sort of underlying violence within the streets of London. So, you know, the block of building thrust forward, that's a very aggressive verb choice. It's almost as if as you go near the building, it's almost seems to be like attacking you as you go near it. And that's interesting because this building and the door of this building ultimately is where Mr. Hyde lives or hangs out when he's at Dr. Jekyll's home. It's kind of a back entrance to Dr. Jekyll's home. There's other elements of the idea that there's some violence here. So in these streets, the schoolboy had tried his knife on the moldings of the building, obviously knifing at the building. That links again to this idea of an underlying violence. It's also just a fairly unpleasant place. Like this back entrance to the house is kind of decayed and worn. And we can look at this as very much symbolic, not only of Mr. Hyde, but also of Dr. Jekyll. Dr. Jekyll has a forward-facing appearance of being this Victorian gentleman, right? That's another context point you need to know about, is that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Utterson represent Victorian gentlemen, these upstanding members of society. But the back entrance to Dr. Jekyll's house is full of decay and ruin and violence, right? And of course, as we come to learn, Mr. Hyde is the darker, evil side of Dr. Jekyll, which he is able to let out with a certain potion, right? Obviously, because this is a bit science fiction-y as well with that. So this is the first instance of the building and the door that's being mentioned. And Enfield recounts how the other day he was walking through the streets, going past this sinister building, and the streets were as empty as a church. I thought that was an interesting quote in terms of context. I like to give you the real good stuff here in this channel. So Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote this novel, was from a strict Presbyterian Christian household. And during Stevenson's lifetime, with the developments in science and the later stages of the Industrial Revolution, there was a beginning to a decline in the amount of people that attended churches. So when he uses this simile of the streets of London being as empty as a church, this is also a social commentary. And I think the fact that it's as empty as a church is obviously a place of morality, people getting together to worship, trying to do good things, I would argue, in a church, like loving and kind is at least the aim. And yet at the moment, this seems to be an amoral place, a place without any major soul or morality to it. Okay, so it's a social comment, which is contextual, and it's also an interesting simile to suggest the amorality of this part of London. We see our first instance of Mr. Hyde. He tramples calmly over this little girl's body and leaves her screaming on the ground. So this is obviously a hideous image of violence. The thing I want you to particularly notice is the oxymoron of trampled calmly. So this is, of course, an oxymoron. And the way that this conveys Mr. Hyde, I think, immediately is linking back to that idea of amorality. A normal person with normal, morality would not trample on a poor innocent little child, and certainly wouldn't do it calmly. If you accidentally, trod on a little boy or little girl's foot while you're in a crowded place, you'd feel awful about it if you hurt them, right? That's normal. Whereas in this case, he's calm. He seems to want to do this, and he seems to be happy, calm in the process of this violence. So that suggests his amorality. For those of you that might not remember or not know, amorality means a lack of morality, an absence of morality. Enfield begins a very important sort of motif, or again repeated sort of idea. I don't want to call it exactly a theme within the novel, which is the fact that everyone in the novel struggles to describe exactly what Mr. Hyde looks like. So he talks instead about what Hyde didn't seem to be. He wasn't like a man. He seemed to be more like a juggernaut. Now, a juggernaut is obviously a massive, heavy, powerful machine, okay? So the juggernaut imagery, it creates almost a sense of the supernatural within Mr. Hyde, and again, a sense of a lack of reality to him, or something strange about him. The other thing that is interesting is that as Enfield keeps talking about this first encounter with Mr. Hyde, he uses a short, simple sentence of, "I immediately took a loathing to the gentleman." So there's this short sentence, and it creates a good deal of mystery, again, because Enfield doesn't seem to exactly explain why he has this deep inner feeling of just disliking Mr. Hyde. And, you could maybe chalk that up to the fact that he just saw Mr. Hyde trample on a little girl. I wouldn't like to see that either, right? But what's then interesting is that there's this sawbones, and sawbones is just a fancy word for a doctor, or it's not even a fancy word, it's just a Victorian word for a doctor. And even the doctor is sick and white with a desire to kill Mr. Hyde upon seeing him. So that is like deeply ironic, and it's also a weird subversion of what you'd expect, because obviously a doctor is supposed to want to help people and to cause healing and not harm. And yet this Mr. Hyde, for whatever reason, is immediately, his appearance is so detestable, like to the soul of someone seeing him, that even the doctor, his instinct for some reason is to want to kill Mr. Hyde. So all of this adds to this idea of mystery around Mr. Hyde, of like what's going on. And all of this then forms a bit of a hook for the reader. In terms of context, another important thing to think about with these quotes is you have to think about the Victorian fascination with deformity, okay? At that time, there were literally things called freak shows, or additions to circuses. You may have seen The Greatest Showman. That's a pretty good movie that talks about P.T. Barnum and the freak show, right? Anyone that was a little bit odd or different, or possibly actually suffering from genuine medical deformities, was seen to be often, either an amusement or possibly even something that they were disgusted by. And often there was a link in Victorian times between deformity or even ugliness with immorality or evil. Okay, so you can see here, for some reason, Mr. Hyde is strange to look at, unfortunate to look at, and it makes everyone dislike him, and it makes him seem evil. Yeah. They then, Enfield and the doctor say to Mr. Hyde, "You need to give some money to this little girl's family that you just trampled on as compensation for this crime. Otherwise, we're going to make such a stink about your name that it will go from one end of London to the other." Another important context here is the fact that reputation was everything at this time. Yeah. So if you were seen to be taken out of London society or villainized, that was it. You would have real problems. And so again, that's a way that the Victorians upheld their strict morality, their strict moral code, and this almost impossible perfection of the Victorian gentleman that almost no Victorian person could actually hit in reality. There's also another addition of the mystery around Mr. Hyde when he walks into that door that was mentioned, the beat down, broken back door that we find out is from the back door of Dr. Jekyll's house. And he goes in there at 4 a.m. and comes out with a check for nearly £100 in another man's name. Now, £100 back then is like worth thousands of pounds in today's money. So imagine how weird that would look if you see this dodgy guy, he tramples on a little girl, everyone seems to instantly dislike him. You say, look, you got to give some money to this family to like compensate the fact you've done this to them. And then he sneaks into the back door of some dingy house and comes back out with a check for thousands of pounds, not signed in his own name, but signed in someone else's name. That is really mysterious and strange, isn't it? And so this adds to the mystery portion of the novel, of course. And then after a little while, Utterson just asks a bit more about Mr. Hyde. And again, we have this idea that there's just something wrong about his appearance, but no one can put their finger on it. So all of this, these quotes that I'm mentioning here, just links to what I just said a minute ago. there's this mystery around him for some reason. There's something that seems up with him or wrong with him, but it's not specific. It's hard for them to specify what's wrong with him. And that's it. The only other quick thing that I think is kind of funny is that it turns out that Mr. Utterson has known that this door was the back door of Dr. Jekyll's this whole time. And so Mr. Enfield is a little bit ashamed at the end for spreading this gossip. He says, "I'm ashamed of my long tongue." This is kind of a little bonus extra thing I wasn't going to talk about, I guess. But this is also then known as synecdoche. And synecdoche is when part of something represents all of it. So in this case, the tongue is obviously what you use to speak. And in this case, he's saying that his tongue is long, basically saying his tongue has been used more than it should. He's gossiped, he's said something that he shouldn't have said. And now Mr. Enfield's a bit worried about that. So that again links to reputation, the theme of reputation. Victorian gentlemen, obviously they weren't expected to gossip, all that good stuff. So that is chapter 1, part 2 wrapped up, and I'll see you in the next one for chapter 2. Thank you.